right. Thank you all for being here. I didn't know people cared about this stuff. Big word in the title, epistemology, so I'm always like, if I put a big word in it, people don't really show up. But this should be very, very fun. So we're going to trace essentially sort of the history of knowledge and sort of the Western world, how we come to know things and how the way we know things is changing with artificial intelligence right now. My name is Ruby Thelot. I'm a designer, artist, and cyberethnographer, which means I study communities online. I also teach at NYU, where I teach design and media theory. And I also make software with the computer, and I make art with the computer. So in the last couple of years, I've been working a lot with AI. And both as like a tool, as a medium, but also as an object that itself is in my work. I want to begin by asking you a question today. Maybe you could just opine out loud, but what was the cause of the Trojan War, if you remember? Helen, yeah? Right? Remember the beautiful Helen, who is so beautiful she calls it 10-year war, right? These days she'd be on a raya. So in 2022, I made a short film called A Single Spartan Girl, which was entirely made with AI using this custom stable diffusion workflow. It was essentially like a stop motion using these like Grecian style, pictorial styles. If you've seen like vases from the antiquity, that was sort of the inspiration for it. What was interesting to me about A Single Spartan Girl is its topic, which relates to me both to as AI, but also how we use it to produce knowledge. I want to talk a little about that project because I think that with these new technologies, there are people who make art about technology, artists who use technology to make art, and artists like myself who use technology to make art about technology. The phrase "a single Spartan girl" actually comes from a book called Wittgenstein's Mistress by David Markson. Markson writes this sort of contemporary literary fiction, almost like a stream of consciousness book in the sort of heritage of Joyce and the likes. You're really unsure of the perspective or the objectivity of the narrator in the book. And they walk through what feels like an almost apocalyptical landscape. The narrator is reflecting upon the great events of the Western civilization and says, "I cannot believe that the Trojan War was started by a single Spartan girl," which I thought was very beautiful, because I think I've always loved Helen as a concept. And it sort of tickles my lover bone a little bit. So this question was very interesting to me because, like many of you, I've read the Odyssey growing up. And in high school, you sort of read this mythicized tale of this war, which has some like doubtful grounding in truth. We don't still quite know what exactly happened. Upon reading and doing some research, I actually found that the events in both the Iliad and the Odyssey were highly contested by Herodotus, who was the first historian in the Western tradition, a Greek historian at the time. He actually said that through his research that Helen had been sort of given back at the time, and sort of war was it was just a pretense. And the more I dug, the more I encountered certain figures like Heinrich Schliemann, who's a German archaeologist. I like him a lot. So he's not actually an archaeologist. He's just a guy with a lot of money. As Americans, you may relate to this concept now. So he has so much money that he decides to charter an expedition to Turkey to find Troy because he loves Troy. And so Schliemann sets out, brings a bunch of men, and is like, "We're going to start digging." And they dig, and they dig, and they dig, and they dig, and they find nothing. And they dig, and they dig, and they dig, and they hit something. And so they look, and they see remains, and they think to themselves, maybe we found Troy. So they call the experts in, and the experts take a look at what Schliemann's found, and they look at the pile of dust that's right next to the hole they've been digging in. The archaeologists say, well, you found Troy, but you found the cities tend to be formed in layers archaeologically, so you've dug through the Troy you were looking for. I've always liked this image as something very, very beautiful, to want to find something so much that you end up destroying it in your quest. But that's neither here nor there. The question remains fundamentally to me, as we do the excavation of the site in Turkey, what actually happened and what was the actual cause of this war? When I asked ChatGPT, it gave me sort of a two-fold answer, sort of the historical context, but also mentioned Homer. And what I think is very, very interesting is that when we have these contested histories, these sort of fraught or contentious statements, what does it mean to ask an LLM for that answer? You can ask what was the cause of the First World War. It'll tell you probably the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. But histories are highly debated, highly contested, and specifically because they are written by specific historians. Part of what the work is trying to question is the question of who writes these histories and why. The question of writing is important because in the context of LLMs, they are based on our writing. As you know, we take the internet and all written content, we scrape it, put it in a database, and that is what we call training with an AI model. So what does it mean for, say, a historical account to have 10 books versus one, right? 10 people agree on one thing, the other person doesn't agree on the other one. What does it mean for a book to be erased or indexed or burned? If we're talking from a pure volume perspective, which book then becomes represented? Whose truth then is represented through the large language model? I ask you to think about something controversial, debated, something that perhaps is only available in a de minimis fashion in the LLM. What does it mean to be a single scholar who opposes a hegemonic idea towards a cultural or historical event? To have your piece of knowledge you're trying to prove it to be this big thing, but essentially you're just one person versus mountains of book. What does it mean then for people when looking for answers to ask an LLM and essentially be getting with this average answer? This answer does not represent the breadth of what history could be, but the singular, hegemonic, uniglossal, is a term I'm going to use in this context, of a single tongue, and have that now be disseminated as this new production of knowledge. And this is what kind of worries me. In the actual work, what I do is that I take the poetry of Sappho, who's this great Greek poet, who wrote about Ellen from sort of like a love perspective. I take Herodotus, I take AI, I take myself, and I attempt to build what I call this sort of polyglossal, meaning many voices speaking together in a story. I do this because history is not a monolith. History is still being sort of discovered, excavated, made, and written as we speak. In 2022, Google published a paper for their new model called Lambda. And in it, they describe the ways that they identify what is true. So you're probably familiar right now with ChatGPT. You see the little words below. It says, please be careful, not all the information is correct, right? They give you a little warning. And I was really curious as to know, how do they try to prevent LLMs from hallucinating? That's a term people use for lying. And what's very interesting is that they do something called reinforcement learning from human feedback. So you have a bunch of prompts, and there's these human labelers who come in and sort of say good, bad, don't be racist, don't do this, don't do that. And that's really through human feedback. There's, I think, like two very interesting factors with this. First of all, there's the actual conditions through which this labor is being produced. You may have seen the accounts. There was a big piece in the Time about where this labor is actually being effectuated, namely usually in third world countries where people are paid like pennies on the dime to essentially label almost piecemeal, similar to what we call like the mechanical Turks. And the second is the conditions through which they produce their knowledge. For instance, if a statement is contested, well, so they have this thing called consensus knowledge building. So if you're a labeler and you're not sure, well, you get to sort of put something for review. And then 3 other labelers who are also working at like breakneck pace to produce this knowledge must opine on whether or not this statement is true. Now you can start to figure out that this is maybe not the best way to produce knowledge, because not only are the individuals sort of forced to do this at high speed with probably very little care, but also is truth 3-4 people somewhere agreeing on something and then say, okay, let's run it, let's push it? Probably not. At the time, Lambda had about 80% what they called groundedness, which was the ability for a fact to be substantiated by a Google link. Now, you'll notice Google uses the term groundedness and not truth. Because groundedness is the ability to verify information with a source. Not quite the truth. But I guess, a proxy, if you will. You may also ask, yes, okay, the knowledge is produced through agglomerations, scraping the written information, and then it gets run through this reinforcement learning, specifically with written content. But what happens when a story, say, is written in a language that is not English? What happens if a story happens somewhere where there's little to no internet connection? I'm from Haiti, where there are computers, but the sort of penetration of the internet is not at the same level. If a story is happening in China, so when you take a look at a data set like the Common Crawl, about 40 to 60% actually are just European languages, meaning the forms of knowledge that are present in those data sets are peculiar and are also geographically located. And so, once again, the question remains, who gets to produce that knowledge? And whose stories are being told within the context of these data sets? So I think the economists did a similar analysis. It was about 50% of the text was in English, and the other 35% was European languages. Notably absent and underrepresented was Chinese, Japanese, Asian, Middle Eastern, African, Oceanic, Native American languages. Notably, it'll be obvious to you that Mandarin is like one of the most spoken languages in the world, well above English, but it is not present in the data set in a proportional fashion. So think about what this means for knowledge, for instance. If you have a singular idea about history and that idea is not translated in the language of the model, in English or in other European languages, either that idea becomes underrepresented or simply effaced or completely erased. Now, design, so I want to talk about images as well, because the same issue happens in the realm of images, where you have the very famous data set. It's called Lion, L-A-I-O-N, which has probably some of your images in there also, if you've posted on Facebook or any of these platforms. And so an initial dilemma we faced in sort of the early image models was that if you asked it to show you a doctor, a professor, a happy family, well, it usually showed you a white family. Because those were the faces that were present in these specific data sets, and there was an initial skew or bias because that's how they were labeled. It's not truly a willful desire to efface these communities, rather it's just that cameras are more popular, more prominent in the West, and images have been produced for longer. And when we get to a point where that skew exists in the data set themselves, now, once we start to produce movies, music videos, short films, using a lot of these wonderful AI applications that are going to make our producers very happy because our budgets are going to go down, and we are asked and tasked to make a scene or represent certain individuals, well, those biases then sort of seep into our art forms. They seep into the new things we create. And the people who are absent in the data set also become absent in the art we create. You have a problem of skew representation within those data sets. Thusly, you'll also have that in the artworks you create if you use these tools. The things that we try to represent are averaged out, which means that you no longer have a unique point of view. Rather, you get the average of what is in the data set and not the global average. As an image maker myself, this is somewhat worrisome because I think that images thrive when they're in the realm of the unique, the idiosyncratic, when images are born out of love, out of care, out of community, not when they're averaged out. There have been many very interesting attempts to build specific data sets that represent different communities. I can think of the work of Mine Ataru, who has been working very hard, for instance, to capture the hairstyles of African populations, which is a cornrow model based on her own research, because those hairstyles were not present in these original data sets like Lion. Similarly, Mine did another work around the Benin bronzes that are at the British Museum and not in Benin, and sort of scanning them, building a data set, almost like a work of digital excavation, digital archival, and the creation of a personal data set that tells her people's history. It is only through that data set that Mine is able to tell her truths, the one that are quite literally through the process of taking an artifact, removing it from the place it was made in, and sort of recontextualizing the Western context. That is a truth that is being rewritten by somebody else also. And this is something I find very interesting as a route for image makers. What does it mean to create your own set of images from which you can generate more? What does it mean to have a unique perspective that is not available to all, but to you or the people who you let use your model? You're probably already familiar with the idea that you are not paid for the images and words that you wrote on the internet if you're writing fan fiction or on Tumblr or whatever. And now people pay $20 a month to use ChatGPT, but potentially all of our words, all of our images are in these data sets. So in a sense, right, the idea of building our own unique, closed-off, walled-off set of images potentially is a form of proprietary resistance. So when I asked what was the cause of the Trojan War, I was really thinking about what is truth, who gets to make it, who gets to produce it. In philosophy, there's this concept of epistemology, which is, how do we know what we know? How is knowledge produced? I've been thinking recently about how, this famous sort of idiom that the winners write history. And I was watching this amazing lecture by Richard Bolliott, the late Richard Bolliott, who's a professor at Columbia, called A History of the World, for instance. And I thought it was very germane to this question, specifically because Bolliott, who was there in the 50s and 60s when a lot of the history departments were being built in American universities, reminds us that not only do the winners write history and the textbooks, but the departments with the most funding also. So, if you're asking a question about history, what kind of content is forming that? Well, a lot of the textbooks that we have in our classrooms. For instance, Middle Eastern studies is a new construct. Around the 60s, right? It's when the Cold War happened, there was a vested interest in learning more about the Middle East because Russia was slowly encroaching and peddling influence there. And so those textbooks have been produced for 40 years, are now digitized. Maybe have 2 chapters on the Middle East, but if the Oceanic Studies department only had that much funding, we had 1 chapter. And so these are the things that get represented in writing and then thusly in the data sets as well. And these are individual decisions that are not at scale of large language models becoming the causes of the truths we choose to believe. Recently, Maggie Appleton, who's a great writer, wrote an essay about William Morris. Maybe you know him, the great arts and crafts artist. He makes these, wallpapers or very ornate, very beautiful. And funnily enough, arts and crafts was kind of a response to the industrialization in England. So Morris is very popular. If you go on Etsy right now, you can buy a poster from Morris. And Maggie, who's sort of a lover of Morris's work, starts to look at some of these posters that she sees one that she likes. And because she's seen the work, maybe she's been to the V&A, she's been to a few of the shows, she's like, I haven't seen that one before. And so she goes on Wikipedia, and she tries to find the work that she is buying from this Etsy seller. And as she looks closer to the image, she zooms in, she realizes that it's not a real Morris work. It's just AI generated. Put in the journey, give me beautiful green flowers with yellow petals in the style of William Morris. And you can sort of have a high res of it, put it on Etsy, and sort of sell it as a Morris. I've been talking a lot about this idea of the catalogue raisonné, which is a book, or sometimes a series of volumes, that catalog and list all the works made by an artist. If you're an artist who's very prolific, you might have 10 volumes. I have the one from Jericho, who I like a lot. And these objects are, to me, very important sources of truth because they cannot be toyed with. And because they're sort of wholly arrested and static. You can imagine a world where a person buys this Morris poster, potentially decides to write about it for XYZ reason, and slowly but surely these artificial truths start to make their way into the written content that slowly then gets scraped and re-entered into our models. And so these sources of truth to me are becoming more and more important in a world where AI generation becomes better and better. Though Maggie was able to identify slight details which showcased how this image was generated, I'm very optimistic that in the next couple of months or the next 5 years, we will not be able to tell the difference. The models are already improving month to month at neck-breaking speeds, and I think they'll be able to reproduce anything with high fidelity. So I feel behooved as an individual, as an image lover, as an image maker, to start collecting these catalogs because they will become my own source of truth. I feel behooved as a lover of artists and makers to start building these sources of truth because, well, either we have to build our own communal archives or maybe put the information online through scanning or something like that, but I think it's going to be very, very important to sort of have a place where you can sort of anchor your knowledge of specific things in a world where things can be altered. And this is not really born out of malice. When I say this, probably these new truths will be born out of mistake, maybe the laziness of a PhD student, more than any sort of malice whatsoever. And you can sort of see how this has downstream impacts on what we choose to see, how we choose to accept it, how we know who makes what, and what essentially is real or not. What this question of truth really evokes to me is that we're slowly returning to a time where truth is no longer produced visually, or just through the internet or through text, but we're going more to a one-to-one personal communication, essentially orality and physical objects. The reason being that in a world where everything can be generated, especially in the digital realm, the levels of skepticism increase. If you are suddenly duped every so often by an image online, your level of trust in images decreases and your skepticism increases. What the skepticism done at a global level, at the digital level, is sort of like my parents used to be like, don't trust the internet, don't listen to Wikipedia, go to the encyclopedia, go to the library instead, and whatnot. And I think that they've been, in my sort of schooling, they were thoroughly defeated. Now I'm like, Wikipedia good, parents wrong. But I think this increase in skepticism is actually going to be very deleterious to knowledge production online and will increase what I call local truth making. I trust my neighbor more about an event that has happened in my neighborhood more than I'll trust Twitter, because as soon as the video generation gets good enough, I won't know if what I'm seeing is real. But if my neighbor saw it, right, first-hand or second-hand account, I can trust them. They're my neighbor, wouldn't lie to me. In this weird roundabout way, we've been in a highly textual world for a very, very long time. We write account about what has happened, we take images, take videos, and these videos were very pivotal, sort of fundamental piece of American culture, right? Everything from Prince at the Super Bowl to the Rodney King assault. We look at these videos and they've changed culture in a fundamental way because they were these sort of strong markers of truth. To see the Rodney King assault is to be faced with the truth of police violence, for instance. The impact of video, the impact of documentary potentially decreases as the capacity for video and image generation increases, which is something I think about a lot. And as the power of these images and video decreases, what comes back? Well, orality. It's almost like we're returning to the oral tradition of the griot, who's the African storyteller, the bard in Europe. So weirdly, when we want to answer the question, what was the cause of the Trojan War? We go back to our contemporary Homers, people who walk around and tell these stories, people who are my neighbors, my peers, people with whom I share a locality. As we approach a more oral age, as knowledge becomes produced no longer by text, but now by speech, the power of images and videos evanesces in favor of that of the bards. When I look for an answer to what was the cause of the Trojan War, I ask Homer and not ChatGPT. Thank you. All right, so question time. Yes, Will.
I'm curious, like, as a designer and someone who makes images, how do you see your practice continuing in a world where maybe people don't trust your output as like an image output versus a normal output? Because you can't know most of the people personally.
So, I think that your role as an image maker now is to not only produce images, but also produce context. This is essentially, I think, a continuation of the trajectory of sort of the millennial internet, which is like authenticity, realness, this ability to showcase yourself in a sort of raw and unadulterated way. Now, you've seen platforms like Be Real start to popular, because it didn't really last very long, but that was a call, I think, an appeal to this desire for authenticity, immediate authenticity. You can't fake it. You had to post the photo right now, or if you were late, people would know. So I think we're going to see more and more experiments in this sort of instantaneous realness. I also, when I talk about global skepticism, I think the flip side of that is sort of this return to the local. So if I'm an image maker, then perhaps the images I'm making share a context with people who are looking at them, say at a gallery space in my neighborhood or in my city, because that context is important to differentiate the real from the fake. It is not something that you can just sort of gather or have, I think, outside of sort of lived experience. It's actually interesting because it's a shift, I think, in a lot of the ontological prerequisite to sort of share experience with people. If an image was enough to understand an event, if a video was enough to feel an event, then now I think more is required for us to share this sort of same common reality.
Hello, I'm Marie. I'm a first-year PhD student in the anthropology department at NYU. I loved your talk. It was super interesting. My question is two parts. So the first part is about working in the digital space, working on AI. So many scholars have brought up this issue of how any work on the digital is really going to be out of date by the time it's published. And the temporality of doing this work is always in flux, but also alongside the pressures of like needing to produce always relevant work. And then along that vein, my other part of the question is if you could talk a little bit more about cyber ethnography, what you've identified as one of your research methods that have shaped this talk, or just generally, is it different from visual ethnography more generally? How did you come to that term?
Yeah, to answer the first question, it's a bit of a challenge. So for instance, I had a paper come out last year or 2 years ago in the journal AI Societies called Search for Sentience. It's about our proclivity to ascribe sentience to artificial intelligence. I was talking about Blake Lemoine, who's an engineer at Google, who sort of raised an alarm when he identified sentience in one of the models they were working with. And this is really structural. It's not like a very fun answer, but send in the paper in February, get accepted in March. It doesn't come out for like 6 months. And because of the speed of this industry, well, that was old news by the time the paper came out. But it has to be peer reviewed. People like myself who do this, we don't get paid to peer review, so it's just kind of infrastructural. I don't quite know how we can speed up sort of the publication process. There are these like preprints people are doing now, so on ArcCiv, you'll have a lot of preprint papers that are not peer reviewed about AI, and people just like putting them out there right away. That's been a method, but of course, in terms of production of knowledge, production of information, we're sort of eschewing the technical academic method by publishing preprints. And hopefully everybody who's reading them understands that they haven't been peer reviewed, but you can sometimes have your doubts. Cyber ethnography, it really started, I think, with the reason why I'm here in many ways is I had a meme page. That's how I sort of kicked it off like 10 years ago. I'm from Montreal, Canada. I had a francophone meme page with a couple of my buddies, and just kind of fucking around, and my university reached out for me to go and talk about it, and I was like, talk about what? Images on the internet? And until I sort of stepped foot inside university, I didn't really realize that this was a full field of study. And I was like, whoa. And I spent so much time online. I'm an only child, and so a lot of my time spent was just on the computer. And when I listened to the other academics who should speak, I was like, wait, I have, first of all, first-hand experience in this, but I have access to a lot of communities that these people have no idea of. I was really big into what people call weird Facebook. Seeing the trauma response of people who were there in 2014. I see you, fellow soldiers. So I was like, oh, I can write about these specific communities. I wrote about this group called, sometimes that AOMNO, which was a macro making group. I wrote about Cool Freaks Wikipedia Club, and essentially doing sort of primary research in these communities, doing interviews with the individuals in the communities, and I got very lucky, got to travel the world, go to Estonia and all over the place to talk about this, specifically because I think there was a lack of scholarship in these niche, usually closed-off spaces that were not accessible to academics who I think had a lot of interest, but not necessarily access to those communities.
Thanks, wonderful presentation. While you were talking about things that stood out for me, and I was really holding on to was whose truth gets represented through large language model. My name is Noah. I'm a PhD student at NYU. And I'm also interested in memes. I work on memes. And at the point I was also doing research, and I asked ChatGPT to generate an image on slave plantation, and it's like, no, I can't do this based on ethical considerations and reasons. And why these ethical reasons might be altruistic and well-intended, and how do we reconcile that with the fact that there are extant, state-sponsored measures to repress, history in places like the South, of the U.S., where critical race theory, is being banned from being taught, and works by Black scholars and artists, are being banned. How do we reconcile that with the fact that, Black voices are not being represented and being taken away from the streets?
Yeah, I think this conversation is made even more salient because I think we're seeing live in a way that I think most people didn't expect from the 21st century. At least in America, I call it indexation. I think the index was what the Catholic Church had, but the indexation, by which I mean the interdiction for people to read or access certain books, right? And I think once we see this, I think we understand perhaps that sometimes it's very overt, but even the choice of specific books in curriculums, think about when you publish a book, for instance, there is, if your editor likes you, they might send it to specific public libraries for it to be held. And they can refuse to hold a book for XYZ reason. And that's like a county by county thing. And I think essentially like the way we build our databases are often based on, I think, local choices, which is hard to consider because I think we see things as like being very global, very accessible, but a lot of things disappear by simple virtue of just not being archived, not making it to specific libraries that can actually maintain things. And now I think a third force in that is just governments who refuse to sort of speak on or teach or instruct students in specific histories. And I think now we can put a pin in that specific idea and try to think about, were there any other moments where that was just covert and where things were taken off the internet or things were no longer present in the data sets that are now being used. I think my sort of radical idea, hot take if you will, is that I wonder if this absence is a superpower. When I think about the potential use cases for a lot of these tools, I think about warfare, I think about surveillance, I think about how oftentimes these tools, which can be delightful and joyful and wonderful, can be turned, I think, into tools of oppression. And I wonder if invisibility is not a super ability. I'm reminded of the words of the great Edouard Glissant, who said, "I clamor for the right to opacity." Yeah. And I wonder if in being opaque, we are then being protected in a way. That'd be like my hot take as to whether or not I want to be present in those data sets.
Hey Ruby, I was wondering, because it seems to me like you take something like Wikipedia, and that became, that was originally touted as the sum total of all human knowledge, which a lot of people took umbrage with, but now it's kind of accepted as this community-run, community policed or whatever, place to get knowledge from. Could there be like an image Wikipedia wherein these LLMs I'm trying to like find the words for this, wherein communities start to take ownership over like the places, in Wikipedia, it's like the pages are kind of edited by people that are like, the forestry page is edited by people who are really interested in that, and they are really, invested in that and invested in the knowledge of that. Could a similar kind of system work for images, I wonder, where it's like the William Morris fanatics all police the William Morris so that Etsy image immediately becomes obviously a fake. Do you know what that means? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. I think from if you want to see knowledge production in digital, Wikipedia is a great place to just read the notes and the revision. It's a great place to see how people argue. The second thing I want to mention is how right now, actually, a lot of Republicans are very angry at Wikipedia because they believe it has a specific slant. And so certain things not getting represented on Wikipedia. And so I think that as an institution, even it has its own biases, in spite of being community-led. I think there's many reasons for that, potentially just like who chooses to volunteer on the internet versus like at church or something, I don't know. But I think there's this sort of utopic dream that the internet is a place of equal representation, right? We will all be digital bodies, we will all be able to voice our minds and speak our truth, and we'll all share this sort of digital, what do they call it, the town square. But that just hasn't been from a digital divide standpoint, who gets access to the internet first, who then has the resources to game the sort of attention algorithms, so on and so forth. I'm very interested in seeing communities collect their own data sets, usually for artistic or archival purposes. The specific on images, that the volume of images you need is very, very large. I have a very, very good image generation model. So two things can happen. Either the requirement of images could go down over time as technology improves. But this is the reason why I think top companies are doing it now. My friend worked at still works at Shutterstock, and they're running out of stock images to train these models. So like Shutterstock is like actively trying to pay people to produce more images because otherwise they're running out. So you'd have to have a very visually active community to even sort of have like a percentage of the amount of images required here.
This kind of goes back more to what you were saying about invisibility and creating like a personal database of images and a catalog of things you know to be true. To me, does that mean like it necessarily exists like in the material world, like away from sort of the scope where it could be reincorporated into these LLMs? Or do you think that there could be a way in which like this truth could be posted digitally?
Are you referring to like fantasy, like something fantastical.
Or I mean, if you're making like a list of sort of all of the works of an artist that you know to be from that artist, and you kind of don't confuse something like that, do you think that list kind of has to be printed out and kept the material well to be like not sort of reincorporated into an LLM model and like that's sort of like.
Well, the question becomes a question of where do we access information. If you have arthistory.com and you're putting that list on there, then sure, I think that's like a decent way, but the question always is whether or not, if we believe that our children, our students are going to access knowledge through the LLM, is this information being produced sort of literally from the art history website, or is it an agglomeration of arthistory.com and a bunch of other sites? I can give you a specific example here is that a lot of more commercial platforms have editorial, and they hire writers to write about artists, and though the writers are well-meaning, myself included, can be underpaid to write an essay. And so you do the essay, and then you're not spending the whole 5 months doing the research. And so that knowledge ends up on a very official website. But I didn't spend like a whole year researching and actually going to the sources, going to the archive or at which university. So you can think about the very, very subtle ways in which that knowledge gets sort of slightly altered over time. And how when you do this sort of averaging out, if someone refers to my article instead of your, the chain of knowledge is what's, I think, most interesting to me here. I'm going to go here and I'm going to go like this.
Hi, Ruby. My name is Jeremy. I'm a first-year student for the MFA program here at ISD. We're learning a lot this semester, just this year in general, about AI. Coming back from my work, just recently doing about creating our own AI agents. And just around governance as well when it comes to AI and the lack of governance that we're experiencing right now. What are your thoughts on, because I have thoughts on, utilizing AI to kind of, or alongside like marginalized communities, because we learn about indigenous AI, how they actually create an AI model using indigenous people's memory laws, and how they utilize AI, and I feel like AI is here, it's currently being implemented in a lot of people's daily lives, and replacing browsing, just the way people kind of interact with the internet and online space. And I feel like we need to like kind of navigate and kind of shift gears and how we kind of, talk and discuss AI, especially when it comes to marginalized communities. Like maybe having them within the room or creating models based on one community's point of view could be beneficial in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I feel like because there's lack of governance, it's like kind of a race to the bottom. One of our professors said it requires how people go around AI, and it's increasing kind of like span and skill set. How do we implement that within marginalized communities while also making sure their voices are being heard and properly represented? And is there space for that currently right now, or is that something that should be happening 2-3 years from now when it slows down?
I think there's a few different aspects here that are very interesting. I think one thing that I like a lot is this idea of the cycle of dispossession, which comes from Shoshana Zuboff, who's a great professor and probably familiar with surrealist capitalism. And it's about the ways through which technology starts as being sort of innocuous, we have this innovation, and slowly makes its way through our daily lives. And I think we're very much in the phase of sort of dissemination right now, where every single one of our apps, I think is like an AI button for some reason, I want to make a joke right now, but I think any joke I make will literally like Instacart, I think it's like an AI thing, where like, you should ask them for your grocery list or something. And the more it becomes present in our daily lives, specifically our daily technological lives, the more we come to take it as natural. There's sort of a matter-of-factness to a lot of knowledge where we just take it as is. Maybe because we don't usually control the version of the software we're using. We used to be able to revert back. Some of you maybe had like jailbroken iPhones back in the day where you can choose which iOS you're using. We no longer really have that luxury, which means that if Apple chooses to do Apple Intelligence and this specific version, then we will all have this same thing. And most of us, I don't, but have automatic updates. The second piece is, I don't know if just being there is the thing that must be done. I'm much more interested. There is an amazing lab at NYU where the great Karen Embry is doing some great work there as their associate director, where they are using sort of AI, but specifically for very specific and targeted uses. Studying the impact of food coupons in a place where it is very difficult to manually collect all the receipts from the grocery stores and whatnot, and then using OCR, which is sort of character recognition, in order to process all that data. That's AI, very specific, very targeted, in service of marginalized communities uptown. I think what is required here is attention and specificity to the use cases versus this great idea of generality. I think, AGI, this general intelligence, is much more daunting than a very, very specific problem. I mean, we're designers, right? So we have a problem, we try to fix it, and I think that the current mentality around AI is this sort of more general idea that it can sort of do anything, or the goal in building AGI is for it to do anything, which is not following the design process. It's like just sort of building for building in many ways. So I know it's like a not satisfactory answer as to what needs to be done from an inclusion perspective. I think that the targeted uses by specific organizations is very, very interesting. But I don't know if just like being in the room is necessary. And frankly, I'm not gonna say that. It's being recorded.
I've been frustrated, particularly in the past couple of weeks, with Googling something because we just get all ads.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am tempted to find information via LLMs that will at least search outside of capitalism. And then I've on more a subjective level, I've been wanting to get people's opinions about so I'll go on Reddit or TikTok or something, which it relates to what you're saying. But more of a practical question, what resources are you using to get information, whether that's finite information or on a subjective level, people's opinions? Do you have more suggestions than Reddit and Google?
What kind of questions are you going to look for on Reddit, just from my understanding?
I think about products, and Googling is hard because
Yeah, it's all ads.
Yeah.
Look, if I'm being totally honest, this guy came up with my TikTok today. Was talking about some Korean product for skincare, and the skin looked great. So I was like, I put on my Amazon cart. I thought it was very funny because at the end of the video, he said, "There's no link for this product. You have to Google it yourself because I'm not trying to sell you anything." And I was like, "Okay, nice." So, will it work? I don't know. Come back next year and you'll tell me if I'm glowing. But I don't know. It's you have to take, I think, a leap of faith on the internet these days. There are literally laws from the FTC as to you should disclose your advertising, but I think people are doing all sorts of not quite an ad, they're just reviewing, they get the product for free, So, and then I work in startups, and as you know, or you may not know, one of our big growth strategies is actually going on Reddit, buying aged accounts, and sort of astroturfing communities so we can popularize our products. And so having done that myself, I'm like, Reddit is great, but also it is not the end-all, be-all. And then there's the experts. We're in a crisis of expertise, right? We don't trust our doctors, we don't trust our scientists, we don't trust anyone. So who do we trust? The neighbor. I knock on my neighbor's door, and maybe I'll ask them or something. That's when I talk about this sort of hyper-local global skepticism, that is like a consequence. If I can no longer trust anything on the internet, I gotta go ask Ethan, my neighbor. But his opinion is I trust him. A second order consequence of this actually is that if knowledge is being produced locally, then the qualities or the levels of knowledge differ based on where you live. If knowledge is produced locally, then your zip code determines what kind of knowledge you obtain. Regina.
Okay, hi Ruby. I'm surprised it hasn't come up, but in terms of local truth making, as you call it, are you presupposing that your neighbor remains 100% human? In the context of projects like Neuralink and an ever-increasing cyborg reality, how does that relate to your corporeal neighbor? What will your seemingly 100% human neighbor Ethan even look like in 100 years? How does that affect your understanding of truth?
That is an amazing question, Regina. I gotta think about that. Oh, that's what we're here for. The incursion of technology into the body is like very interesting to me. I think we all seen like so much media about transhumanism, and it seems like it's finally happening now, specifically with Neuralink. And I think there was the first human trial, and the guy seemed happy about it. There may be a final step in this process whereby the local production of knowledge is no longer possible if we are all sort of linked in sort of global digital world. Specifically, if we have a brain, you guys all know what Neuralink is, right? It's a brain implant, essentially. And so if that happens, then I think the logic continues, where sort of maybe truth is being produced singularly within the realm of the atomic individual, which actually leads me to another part of my research, like fantasy, which is that a world where people have different sort of realms of truth is a world where common truth is no longer being shared, and where we sort of inhabit the fantastical, our own little worlds where we can create our own truth, and where if I don't care about my neighbor, then suddenly there is no collisions between the different realities. There is I think the hypothesis is very sound that there will become a time where the neighbor is no longer, either fully human or honestly completely replaced. And in that case, this tale of orality, I think is me being slightly nostalgic. I think it's maybe like a respite before sort of the full shift. And then we go to something completely different. Because if we lose sight, if we lose the written word, and if we lose then orality, then I don't think we have anything left. Well, okay, that's not true. There's one thing. So my essay, if anybody's read it, The Balkanization and Babelification of the Internet, there's one thing that we still have, but it doesn't really, it's contentious with the cyborg hypothesis. It's touch. I think I end the essay saying that, but to defeat the sort of breakage of language in the digital, we must decidedly share reality. And we share reality when we inhabit it and when we touch the other physically. So that's like my last sort of barrier of resistance, is touch as sort of the intentional sharing of physical space, but in a full cyborg world, and I don't know what that means anymore. I think if we make a decision as a society, we choose to, I think, let go of that ideal.
I had a question about aesthetics and visuals that we use to make images. I was really captivated by your statement about beauty being in the uniqueness and idiosyncratic elements of going into it. And I've always been interested in how the tools that we use and their errors and flaws become obvious in the human works that we make. And obviously, some of the errors in AI image making let us know that they're AI, like with the hands, with the teeth, etc. But as you mentioned, they're getting less and less easy to detect. So it's kind of open-ended. Like, I'm wondering about if there's a reaction towards this in which we go towards arts and crafts, for example, Or if for AI, maybe there's a reflexive element where it adapts to maybe incorporate errors or incorporate something that resembles a human touch so that it can have this more familiar element. Because it also relates to this element of touch and physicality. So I'm curious if you've thought about that or have any thoughts around those topics.
Yeah, I think if you think about specifically reinforcement learning from human feedback, the question is, what is the labeler like? So if you're in that room, the man that I got to speak to, I believe was in the Congo, and they're all together, and it's like a subcontractor for Meta. If you're in that room and you're looking at images and you're labeling them as good reproductions or not, what are you looking for? And so the aesthetics here, the mistakes are, once again, not necessarily the model itself, but the human labeler sort of maybe having their bias sort of seep in. The second part, I think, of the advance of that technology is that they're getting so good now, the models, that you can sort of use another model to train your model. And so what that means is that it's almost like adversarial. The model decides which one is better. So once again, another sort of chain of knowledge production, or of specific decisions of this is good or this is not good. I'm a big fan of what I call sort of seamfulness, like seeing the seams when something is made, specifically in the technological. I'm fascinated when tools are like nascent. When I look at a single Spartan girl, it is so obviously from 2022 compared to like what Sora can do now, or what Kyber, or what Pika, or what Runway can do now. But that artifact, I think, speaks to a place in time. And when I'm being very romantic about it, the way something looks in the digital, I think, speaks to an era, speaks to a time, speaks to a moment. A lot of my friends are musicians, start to use like old versions of Logic, or like old versions of Ableton, in order to capture the restraints and the constraints of those tools at the time. So you have these like guys who technically may be using the best tools ever. They be using Suno, that new AI app, to make like, no, I use like 2008 Logic because my favorite jungle record or whatever was used to produce that. And the same nostalgia we see in the physical, where people might be buying like TR-808 in the physical, is now being reproduced in the digital as well, which I think is very interesting. Because those tools, they have artifacts. One of my friends and great designer, David Brennick, does the same thing. Same version of Photoshop, 2012, on his same MacBook. Always on the trackpad. David's good, he could buy a new MacBook, but no, he chooses to remain with the same tools.
My name's Hassan. I've only just recently got into the technocracy, or like these techno corporate roles, trying to basically take over the world. And so I have 3 questions. Like literally within the past few days, I just started to think about how to combat this. How would I personally combat this? My first question is, what role do you think blockchain would play in technology? Like what role will it be for us to prove truth, or that something is true, or if that's possible? My second question is, what is your opinion on what do you think could be done about technocracy, about these guys like Curtis Jarvin and Palantir and this corporate takeover of the United States and the West? And what role do you think the commons, what role do you think the commons can play against the technocracy?
Okay, so the first question is about blockchain. Blockchain is very tricky because as a means of truth generation or truth creation, we have a lot of examples of forks. Essentially, when 2 groups of people who share a blockchain decide that they no longer want to share the same truth. The separation between Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash is one of these sort of splits. Ethereum and Ethereum Classics. There's an event happened. There was a big hack in Ethereum. And the Ethereum Foundation and a lot of leaders decided that it's almost poetic. They're like, actually, we're going to go back before the hack. Almost as like a time machine. Like, we're going to go back. We're going to, and this ability to roll back, essentially, this technically immutable, permanent, unchangeable technological tool, I think speaks to our willingness sometimes to alter the truth when it doesn't really serve us, which is why you have like these two chains now. Similarly, there was a big hack this week. I think like $1.5 billion were stolen by North Korean hackers, and people were asking, should we roll back? Meaning, should we alter this thing that's supposed to be immutable again? So, all this to say that I don't necessarily believe that it is just historically has not been a super permanent way to establish truth. I think it has been established communally, which is very interesting to me, but not specifically or not like in an immutable fashion. The second question on technocracy, if I had the answer, I'd be an advisor to the Democratic Party and I'd sort of tell them about it, but I don't. One thing that I do want to talk about, and I haven't heard anybody mention this, I think a lot of people were maybe surprised by this sort of rightward turn in a lot of these individuals because they had, for about 10 years, espoused, I think, a lot of liberal values. There's this wonderful essay from 1995 called The California Ideology. See some head nods. The California Ideology is a great essay which describes the fundamental beliefs in Silicon Valley, which are not right or left, but some weird synthesis of the in-between. In the 60s and the 70s, you had a bunch of hippies, a bunch of people who were anti-war, sort of in California, and at the same time you have this growth of this sort of technological movement, and you have this sort of weird marriage of both. You have the belief that technology will engender this sort of Jeffersonian democracy where we'll all be individuals in cyberspace, able to self-direct, able to do whatever we want outside of the chains of the government, right? If you read a lot of these manifestos, right? The Manifesto for Cyber Independence or for cyberpunks, there's this strong individualism, almost like libertarian. And that's at the heart of a lot of the tech bro beliefs. But at the same time, you have this sort of hippy-dippy, Steve Jobs famously did not even take, refused care and had alternative care. Your friends are probably taking like ayahuasca trips and going to Burning Man. All these things exist together. And so, in many ways, you have what's required for us, at least, is to forget, I think, the sort of left-right dichotomy and realize that a lot of things are layered here. You can be extremely libertarian, and for a period of time, that means that you will accept, a lot of diversity because you don't care who they are, as long as they produce good work, or as long as they're. At the same time, you can still believe that once the time comes, like Curtis Yarvin, that a specific monarch should take over or whatnot. But so this, I think what we're seeing now is the realization of this California ideology. Because you have technocratic beliefs, the belief that technology can improve the government and sort of cut the budget, do all these things, and at the same time you have RFK Jr. in the White House, which I think harkens to me sort of this more hippie sensibility or distrust of, I think, governmental science, distrust of a lot of these sort of formal institutions. So I don't know exactly what to do. I don't know that people are, I think Curtis Yarvin had a big feature in the New York Times. I think people are more susceptible and more aware of his ideas now. I don't think Americans want a king. If I know a little bit about America, it's been here for 4 years, I don't think I like the whole king thing. And so if I think things became a little bit too monarchic, I think there hopefully be a bit of pushback. What can we do? I don't know. We are deeply involved. The moment that we stop using Meta, our pension funds are the pension funds of our universities, their endowments, our hospitals. If the Mag 7, so the 7 big tech companies in the world, lose a lot of their valuation, meaning the billionaires lose their money, we're fucked. Like in the sense that like a lot of our institutions rely on their growth in order to provide us services, which is this like very weird entanglement that we have, usually through these endowment funds. It's not the same in Canada where like a lot of stuff is public, so you're not really relying on the stock market or investments for a lot of institutions to prosper. But the teachers' pensions, the auto workers' pension, they have these huge pools of money, they have to invest it. So if the Mag 7, including whatever Tesla, whatever, they lose a bunch of money because we boycott them, that would actually hurt us and our parents and all of our peers and friends who I think work in these unions who are relying on these pensions to survive. So, I don't know. And then the last question was, I'm asking you,
Oh, the comments.
the comments. I don't know about the comments, I know about audiences. I really want to cultivate audiences. Part of a lot of the work that I'm doing, I think, is for us to resist the temptation to give up on audiences. I was talking to Matt Drivers recently, who's a great artist. Matt and Holly make amazing art with AI, and Matt was saying that this AI slop, which is like, the wave of random bad AI-generated content that's very, very prominent on Facebook right now, is the cost we have to pay for the reduction of the barrier to creation. Now, my problem with that is that I worry that we are not the best media nutritionists for ourselves, meaning provided with AI slop and something difficult or complex to read or spend 15 minutes on YouTube and a 1 minute or 50-second TikTok that's AI generated, I fear we will get the dopamine hit of the TikTok one first. And the only way to resist the temptation of the slop is to decidedly choose to do things that are difficult. To watch movies that are long, even if they suck. To watch music that is not, you don't get a hook in the first 30 seconds, right? And that requires the cultivation of audiences. That requires sitting down with your friends and be like, we're gonna do this thing. And it's gonna take a while for us to reap the rewards of this very, very long or perhaps slightly painful thing we're about to do. And the only reason why people want to do this is because we care. Because we believe that after the 3 hours of, watching The Brutalist, there's something that can happen after that experience. The problem with AI slop is that the physics of slop outpace the physics of art. Slop is rapid, it is highly digestible, and it is magnetic and contagious. Art tends not to have those qualities. It takes time to watch, it is difficult to comprehend, and it is divisive. So the physics are not in favor of art, and if we don't cultivate audiences, slop will win. So that's my sort of spin on the comments question. Okay, one more. Yes.
This kind of goes back to what you said about touch being the way to kind of confirm a shared reality. And as a cyber ethnographer, I'm really curious how you've witnessed or observed these online communities, behaviorally change in an effort to preserve what you said was truth is holy, or to maintain
Yeah, I wrote about furries, and furries are a very, very interesting digital community because, first of all, they've been here for an extremely long time, one of the most durable, persisting digital communities. One of the things they do very well is sort of this hybrid model where you spend a lot of time online, but then depending on where you are in the world, there are multiple conventions that can come to you. And though not all furries attend the conventions, there are a lot of physical touch points should you want to share that physical reality with your peers. And that to me seems to be a very efficacious model to not only sort of grow a digital community, but also have a place where people can share that time together. There's a very famous photo, the famous Tumblr meetup, like all these kids with the jeans, the striped shirts. Maybe some of you remember it. And that is another example. I write also about Tumblr a lot, where if you're building these sort of cores or aesthetics, then, I mean, you can't just be posting about Annabelle, right? You gotta be outside, fitted with a choker, and you gotta live it, you know? So part of it is sort of stepping outside of the digital and deciding to share, even with fashion, to share that reality and share that space.